Very much, Kate. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about emotion, and all you need is emotion. But there's a question mark at the end of that, which hints at a challenge, one of which is to get through this in 10 minutes. The other challenge will become apparent. So we've all read this, right? We all know from Les and Peter's analysis of the IPA Effectiveness Data Bank that so-called emotional advertising has bigger and longer lasting business effects than so-called rational advertising. And here are two highly emotional ads, but there's a big difference. One of them, the Clowns ad for Audi, won last year's IPA Effectiveness Awards Grand Prix. The other one, which is Budweiser's Puppy Love from the 2015 Super Bowl, whilst at the time the advertiser claimed they had metaphorically won the Super Bowl because it had the most retweets ever from an alcoholic beverage advertiser, the most Facebook likes ever. 10 months after that, the same vice president of marketing said that whilst everybody loved the puppies, I wouldn't run those ads again because they don't sell beer. So, bit of a confound here. So emotion can't be all you need. Both of these ads are highly emotional, but one was very effective and the other one wasn't. So what do we need? Well, we need motivation and we need emotion. And they are different, they are linked, but we mustn't assume, and it's a big but, we mustn't just assume a correlation. Sorry, we can assume a correlation, but we mustn't assume that that correlation equals causation. That's the big mistake that most people believe. So let's have a look firstly at what we know about emotion. And I'm not making any of this up, by the way. This comes from science and academic work. So emotions, they are a physiological response to something we experience or that we anticipate in our environment, because our brains are constantly making predictions about our surroundings in order to survive. And so they help our bodies to cope with upcoming situations by, for example, adapting our heartbeat, our blood pressure, releasing neurotransmitters, changing our muscle tension. And these are affective or emotional responses. And they're automatic, they're fast, and they're very basic. They are effectively there to help us prepare to fight or flight. And emotions only have two dimensions. They have arousal, which is the intensity of the physiological response, and they have valence, which is the evaluation of whether something is positive or negative. Now we can feel this, right? We have a visceral experience in our bodies, and we have come to learn over time, and depending on the cultures in which we've grown up, to give these feelings names, like anger or excitement or elation. So how does this relate to advertising? Well, advertising, or an emotional response that is quite literally eye-popping, triggers emotional responses and increases its effectiveness due to when we're in a state of high arousal, things happen. We have physiological changes in our bodies. Our attention span increases. Our senses are sharpened to deeply process the object that has caused the emotional response. And that goes straight into memory. The amygdala and the hippocampus in the brain are co-located so that we can learn for the future. So when our ancestors saw that snake in the grass, we not only snapped to it and we had tunnel vision on that thing, but we remembered where we saw it at the time and forevermore. So advertising that triggers an emotional response has an inbuilt advantage because of these physiological changes. We also know from other studies that emotional arousal can predict sharing, virality in social media. And of course, if an ad has a positive or a negative valence, that can become part of a brand's memory structure, assuming, of course, the brand is correctly assigned to the ad. And having a positive valence is of course, no bad thing. But the emotional response is still only a response. Is it in itself motivating? And to answer this, we also turn to science. Now, a guy called Roy Baumeister and his colleagues did a meta-study of over 4,000 published papers in peer-reviewed journals, scientific and academic journals. And these papers all claim to have a statistically significant causal relationship between emotion and behaviour, i.e. emotion drives behaviour. Guess how many of those more than 4,000 articles they actually found a statistically significant causal relationship? It's actually about 1%. And in the vast majority of those cases, they're what Baumeister called extreme cases, such as punching someone if you're angry, which I'm not sure how that relates to advertising or buying a packet of Persil in the supermarket. But you may have heard of Antonio Damasio's book Descartes' Error, and he has this hypothesis about somatic markers, which a lot of people have then taken to mean that emotion drives decision making. And he cites the case of a patient called Elliot who had a damage in his frontal lobe and couldn't take decisions, and everyone believes that's because he could no longer feel emotion, therefore there must be a relationship. Unfortunately, what most people don't know is that Damasio has been challenged since those publications on his studies, and has actually himself conceded, and I quote, "We caution against the idea that emotion-based signals decide for us other than extreme situations." So if that's the case, what does motivate behaviour? And again, science has the answer. What motivates behaviour is something called the reward system. It sits in the frontal lobe, and what the reward system does is assign value to choices based on what our current goals or needs are. So if I'm hungry, getting food will have a very high reward value for me, and when I've eaten, it has a very low reward value for me. So it's not doesn't have a high value as a choice. And our behaviour is driven by the expected value of a choice, and we learn those expected values over time, through communications, through advertising, associating brands with helping us to achieve goals. And there's a vast body of academic and scientific knowledge that all agrees that goals are what drives human behaviour. They are the system units of human behaviour. And one quotation I love from psychologists is to say that human behaviour is goal directed is a bit like saying that water is wet. It's, for the scientists and academics, it's obvious. One of the things that, if you read Descartes' Error and read about the case of Elliot, Damasio's patient, is that actually what happened was that he had a tumour in the frontal lobe that destroyed his reward centre. And that's why Elliot could no longer make decisions. What most people miss when they read the book is that Elliot could still experience emotions. He was still an emotional human being, but he couldn't take decisions because his reward centre was destroyed, and therefore the decision-making mechanism was no longer there. So I said that there was a correlation between emotion and motivation. Where does emotion fit in decision-making? Again, the scientists and the academics can help us here. What Carver and Shire, the big names in psychology, have said is that we experience emotion whenever the likelihood of achieving a goal changes. So it's like a feedback mechanism in our body that tells us the extent to which we're meeting a goal or not. So if I'm meeting a goal, I feel good, I feel joy, I feel happy. If I'm not meeting a goal, I feel anger or frustration or sadness. And this is all about, in evolutionary terms, it's all about learning for the future. A lovely quotation from a professor at Cambridge recently, who said, what people don't seem to realise is that evolution advanced on behaviour, not on emotion. Emotion is a feedback. It's an outcome of behaviour. It's not the driver of behaviour. So how do we translate this into our world? Sorry if this is too small for you to read, but we can distribute these afterwards. Here's a checklist that we use that separates the how, if you like, the emotional engagement part, from the what, which is the motivational part. So when we're looking at advertising, we could say things like, does the communication evoke an emotional response? And does the brand play an instrumental role in this? Because if it's not, it won't be assigned to that response. Does it do it credibly? And do we leverage distinctive assets as well to help that brand assignment? We can then look at the what, the motivation, and we could say, does the brief include an instrumental link between the brand and relevant goals? Is it distinctive? Does it stage the brand as a means to an end, to goal achievement? So now let's reflect these checklists when we look at the Clownsy Grand Prix winner to see how they were combined to great effect in that ad. So we tested a number of the effectiveness award winners, We tested the emotional response of clowns, and again, apologies if this is too small, but essentially we found a very high emotional engagement that was common across effectiveness award winners. So things like interesting, funny, and not irritating or making me angry, things like that. It's interesting to see what is triggered and what isn't triggered. So it's doing very well at getting emotional engagement. How does that translate and flip over to the other side of the coin, the motivation? So here we're looking at a model that we use, which is neuropsychological goals, and we tested the ad using an implicit testing methodology. And it's a really nice, a perfect storm of the how and the what with this ad, because you've got the drama of the clowns, who are a metaphor for all the idiots on the road who pose a threat, pose a risk to everyone else. And that's juxtaposed with the instrumental link of the brand. So Audi's technology helps you to avoid that risk. And what it does also is help us achieve goals of control. Control was the single strongest psychological goal that was triggered by this ad. Now, control might appear pretty functional or boring in a brief, but it's actually a very deeply motivating goal in our lives, being in control. But it also achieved goals of things like protection and success and reliability. And that's relevant to the category. It's relevant to Audi as a brand. It has a heritage of Audi's brand equity. And this ad, I think, is a really good example of how you combine the how and the what. And if you want to get a relevant, motivating message in an emotionally engaging way, this is a great example of how to do it. And you do need both. So all you need is emotion, really. You need motivation as well. Thank you very much.